Hello and welcome to another episode of Panel on Panels, the podcast about all things comics and comics related. I'm your host, John Campbell. Joining me as always, my co-host, Mike Ergoni.
Greetings.
Mr. Donovan Eilert.
Hi, everybody. How's it going?
All right. We're very excited today. We are yet again taking the podcast on the road. We are here in the home of Mr. Ben Saunders.
Hi.
Welcome to the show, Ben.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
And you are a professor at University of Oregon.
I am indeed, yes.
And you teach about comics. I mean, amongst other things.
Yes, I wasn't hired to do it.
Okay.
I was hired to teach 16th and 17th century English literature. So
Okay.
I can see the parallels and segues there.
Yeah, well, it's funny. You know, people often ask how I, whether I see connections across the different fields. And I don't. I don't, generally speaking, pretend that they're there. I think that, there are, I suppose, sort of, Shakespearean aspects to certain superhero tropes.
Mm-hmm.
And I am interested I've always been interested in how different kinds of works of art get evaluated and how, by which I mean not how we decide whether they're good or not in a classroom, but the sort of stocks and shares of aesthetics, how certain artworks will be really admired at a particular period and then forgotten about in another period, or how those things can reverse. And that's a sort of a common interest that I have across all the different kinds of literature and literary objects that I work with. But I don't try and make connections between comics, generally speaking, and the work that I was hired to do. I think of them as different things.
Sure. So we're always kind of fascinated by people's origin stories. I mean, this is a comic book podcast. And one question I like to ask everybody is, do you remember what sort of the first comic was that really clicked you into the medium?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So there was no British DC, but there was a British Marvel. So as
Marvel UK?
Yeah. And as you can probably tell from what's left of my accent, I wasn't born around here. I was born in Wales in the 60s. And my grandmother bought me the first comic I can remember, which was called Spider-Man Comics Weekly. The British versions of these Marvel comics came out on a weekly basis. They were black and white. They were a little bit bigger than the American ones, and they were anthology titles. You'd have 3 or 4 strips in each, like 6 pages out of an American monthly book.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Across one weekly comic. So Spider-Man Comics Weekly also, I think, had Iron Man and Daredevil in it, I think. But what I remember is the Spider-Man story, and it was a Stan Lee, Gil Kane, John Romita Sr. story about the evil DA Sam Bullitt, and Iceman was a guest star in those issues, as I recall.
Some of his amazing friends.
Yeah, that's right. And I remember actually being really puzzled by it because I was about 6, and I was just really getting into reading, and I couldn't figure out whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, and the cops appeared to be chasing him.
Yeah,
and
I never thought about it like that.
And he was named Spider-Man, which was so. I actually remember asking my mother, "Is he a goodie or a baddie?" And she said, "Well, with a name like that, he must be bad." So I learned.
Makes sense, actually.
Yeah, I learned fairly early on not to trust my mother's assessment of comic books, but it was also, my first encounter with moral ambiguity, probably. He was a good guy, but he was not recognized as one.
Certainly, yeah.
So that was and I fell down the rabbit hole right there, and I never really came back.
I was going to ask, so then it was pretty instant then?
Yeah, there was some back and forth amongst the members of my family as to whether this was a healthy thing or not. I used to spend most weekends at my grandmother's, and when she saw how I liked to read these comics, whenever I arrived at Grandma's house, she would have bought comics. And initially, she wasn't too picky about which ones she was pulling off the newsagent shelves, but then she realized that I was definitely gravitating towards these superhero books.
Right.
And my mother was uncertain as to whether she wanted me reading these things. There wasn't, real literature, but my grandmother said he's reading, and they had a bit of an argument about it. My mother was converted when I went to a magic show when I was about 7 or 8, and the magician asked the audience, all little kids, he said, "This next trick will involve levitation. How many of you know what levitation means?"
Mm-hmm.
And I raised my hand and said, "It means to raise objects with the power of the mind." And my mother said, "How do you know that?"
Because Jean Grey does it every week.
Yes. No, actually, what I said was Doctor Strange has
There
a
we
cloak
go.
of levitation.
Awesome.
Like, duh. And so, at that point, then my mother also was okay with comics. And
That's
so
awesome.
I didn't have anybody, trying to sort of restrict my access to them or anything from
Wow.
pretty early on.
Well, that's certainly good, yeah.
And then in 1977, 2000 AD happened, and that probably was every bit as important as the encounter with British Marvel. And in fact, it lasted as a sort of a love affair. It lasted longer for me because there was a point where I remember becoming, in the early 80s, quite disenchanted with the superhero stuff that I'd really liked when I was younger, but 2000 AD kept me interested. And of course, this is a period when this is the great explosion of British comics.
Oh, yeah.
I missed it. I didn't miss the great explosion of British comics, but I missed every other sort of cultural revolution. Right? I missed I missed the musical revolutions of the 1960s. I missed the golden age of cinema.
Right.
I was never into a band before anybody else was into them. I could never actually say, I saw them in a club with just 30 people.
Sure.
But with comics, that's not true. I was actually really there. I met Alan Moore twice before the publication of Watchmen. In fact, the first time I met Alan, I was 11 or 12 years old, and he was the guy that wrote Future Shocks at 2000 AD. He had not, at that time, even he had written the first Swamp Thing script, but the issue had not yet appeared.
Oh, wow.
So he hadn't even crossed over to the United States at that point in any significant way. And he was very accessible and very friendly. I spoke the first time I met Alan. I talked to him for hours and hours. I mean, literally hours.
Wow.
Over a weekend. Well, it was a science fiction convention in my hometown in Cardiff, so it wasn't a comic book convention. They didn't have many of those. And the guest of honor was a novelist named John Brunner, who you may have heard of. He wrote a book called Stand on Zanzibar.
Yeah.
And so Alan was there with David Lloyd and Des Skin and Gary Leach as kind of the warrior team.
Yeah.
And it wasn't it wasn't a comic show, so not a lot of people were there to speak to them. And he wasn't a famous person at that point. So I took a plastic shopping sack of all the 2000 ADs that he had Future Shocks in. And he signed everyone for me. And and we talked for a long time with my good buddy David Roach and a couple of other people. David went on to become a comics artist in the UK. He joins Judge Dredd and Doctor Who now.
Right. Yeah, that name does sound familiar.
Yeah, he went all the way with it in a way that I did. At the time, I suppose I had fantasies about becoming a comics artist myself. I drew a lot then, but
cool.
There came a point where I realized that was much too much.
I was going to ask about that because it seems like the jump. A lot of people who would be that into comics and would want to do something professionally, you would think comics creation of some sort. When we have a lot of those people on the show, but I'm kind of curious how you made the jump into then academics.
Sure. Well, lack of courage in some ways. I mean, I think, or maybe. It's a long time ago, and the education system in Britain is very different to the United States. And if you wanted to pursue the visual arts, you needed to go to art college, and they were entirely separate institutions from universities. And this is going to sound funny now, given how anxious parents are about their kids doing humanities degrees and so on. But my parents really were worried that if I went to art college, I would be poor and starving, and they were much happy with the idea of me studying English literature.
Right.
I'm sorry, English major over here who's just like, oh, really?
Yeah. But that really was their position, and I had taken a year between high school and college where I was trying to figure out what to do, and I did a lot of drawing in that time. I did the only comic strip I ever actually completed. In fact, I did during that time. I was very pretentious. It was about Czechoslovakian jazz musicians.
Oh, wow. Spectacular.
What was it called?
What was it called? God, I've got it somewhere. It's somewhere in this room.
Man.
It was a ripoff of a Czechoslovakian writer's book, The Bass Saxophone. There's a story about jazz musicians who were also Holocaust survivors. I was kind of stealing bits and pieces of that, but mostly it was because I thought jazz musicians looked really cool. They,
sure,
and it was
visually striking.
Yeah, and especially if you're working in black and white. And so I had this, and I was hugely influenced by Bill Sienkiewicz at that time. And I remember doing things like dipping a toothbrush in the ink and then spraying the splatter effects on the page and sort of masking areas off and that kind of thing. And I spent about a year really playing with that stuff.
Cool.
And but it was hard. And I think, to be honest, at some part of me probably, I don't think I was good enough. I think at some level I knew that I was better with the English literature stuff than I was finally at the end with this comics material. And I still to this, but I learned a lot doing that. And so that now when I became a scholar of comics, I am able to talk to people about, the difference between a brush and a pen, for example, and how that kind of divides whole, that's a major philosophical division in your attitude.
Oh, sure,
comics, right? And it turns out that most people who just read them don't really think about that kind of thing. And I to this day think it's probably the single most labor-intensive way that exists to try and tell a story. I think in the sort of post-digital era, the idea that you could make a movie it's probably easier to make a short film than it is to actually make an extended comics narrative.
Yeah,
and yet people still do it.
Yeah.
So I learned a huge amount that year, but I think amongst other things, what I learned is that I wasn't going to do that. And I left comics behind altogether for a little while.
Really?
In the 90s, I was in graduate school and I couldn't really afford them. And I guess a lot of the stars of the 80s that I was really excited by, some of them were slowing down or self-consciously moving into other directions. Alan Moore would be a classic example.
Sure,
he was
absolutely.
doing less. Bill Sienkiewicz was doing less. The Hernandez brothers sort of killed the Love and Rockets magazine edition 50 and were rethinking about new formats, and I missed some of that stuff. So a lot of people who I had been following just didn't seem to be doing as much, and I wasn't so crazy about that. Certainly, that the image guys of the in the 90s were not as interesting to me in the end. And now I feel actually more affectionate towards them than most people do. I think it's like there's Kiss and there's Pink Floyd or David Bowie, right? And I think of the image guys as being kind of like the Kiss of comics.
I think that's a fair comparison.
And sort of dissing them for not being David Bowie seems to miss the point.
I think the main difference is that Kiss isn't nowadays become this big revelation, starting to become a major force in the industry rather than having some kind of long-lasting effect.
Well, of course, what Image has become. I wouldn't have never have predicted based on what was happening in the 90s that Image would become what it's become, and it's amazing. It's become. One of the best deals in town, clearly.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the books that I'm most excited by come out from Image now. But, like I said, I'm also, whenever there's a kind of collective group pile-on, I'm reluctant to go along with it. And I feel like it's... I actually find Rob Liefeld a really interesting artist. I mean, I know that's for a lot of people, it's much easier to just be strange, to be rude about how strange his work is.
Right.
And I think that's got some. No one ever, if you were really into a certain kind, if you're into the Bay City Rollers in the 70s, if you're into some kind of teeny bop act,
right,
and then you turn 15 and you realize that that was teeny bopper stuff, and you don't want to be into it anymore, you reject it really violently. And I think something like that happened to him. But actually, it seems to me that that art wears on its sleeve all of the weird obsessions of the genre. And
definitely,
I think of him as kind of he's at least as interesting as Fletcher Hanks.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I suppose for some people that wouldn't be a very kind comparison, but but again, I'm trying not. I don't want to go along with these sort of casual dismissal, especially when something's a phenomenon and then it becomes reviled. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in. I'm interested in how those systems of evaluation change and turn on a dime. How somebody can be considered, one of the kings of a profession, and then become one of the most reviled people by the very same audience that a year and a half earlier was passionately collecting the work.
Absolutely.
This really intrigues me. And they did a lot of really interesting things. The Kiss analogy breaks down in some ways because when you think about what they then did in terms of hiring someone like Alan Moore to come and take over their properties.
Right.
That's like Kiss recruiting John Lennon in 1984 or something.
Yeah.
If that had been possible.
My
I'd just
God.
Yeah.
I wouldn't give to have seen that.
Yeah. I mean, but can you imagine if you take the most respected creator of the previous decade,
right,
and you say, come and work for us. We are, we're doing this real pop stuff.
Yeah.
And Alan said yes. That's a pretty extraordinary thing that happened there.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that comes through. We should mention your book, "Do the Gods Wear Capes?" Something that definitely came through, and you talk about a lot in there. Is looking back, because you look back on a lot of older comics that have sort of been written off in a lot of ways. I mean, certain eras of comics have been like, yeah, that was before comics got good.
Yes. I'm really one of the reasons that I prefer the word comics to graphic novel, actually, and the reason that the minor is called the University of Oregon minor in comics studies rather than comics and graphic novels is because it's not just a rejection of the term graphic novel as a marketing term, which isn't actually very useful descriptively.
Right.
A lot of the time, the things that are being described are in fact memoirs and not novels. So it's not even an accurate piece of genre description.
Sure. Yeah.
Often. But it also perpetuates the myth that comics became interesting around about 1986, the period when a certain kind of scholar became interested in them, amongst other things, and the period when you could buy them in Barnes and Noble back when we had bookstores, kids.
In the old days,
yes.
when the books were inside stores.
Yes, the movement from comics out of their specialist stores and into general bookstores is, also seen by a lot of people as the period where they become interesting. And I really like that. I like that old pulpy stuff, but I also it is what the creators people who admired in the 80s were reading.
Right.
So there's definitely still things to be learned from it, and I also think it's just you can find surprising amounts of sophistication, obviously, in these earlier creators, but you can also find the sheer thrill and excitement of people latching onto an art form when it's new, and that is. Unquestionably, the recordings and musical sophistication of, records that were made after the 1950s is superior to a lot of stuff that was made in the 50s. But that 50s rock and roll era is the thing that galvanizes the world.
Right.
And it seems patronizing to say that you might be responding to something primitive there, but and maybe that isn't the right word. Maybe what you're responding to is just the newness and the freshness.
Very true.
And when I look at Golden Age comics, I'm struck by that sometimes. I'm struck by this extraordinary mixture, actually, of people throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. No one knows what is going to make this strip successful. Everybody wants a piece of the action, and it's before television. So you're talking really about one of the most cheap and lucrative forms of mass entertainment in this country for a little while. The reason the Golden Age is called that is because it's not because the comics were the best necessarily, but it was because there was definitely an incredible time to make a huge amount of money, and all in color for a dime.
Right.
That's still not the case? No one's making boatloads of money on comics anymore?
This is a complicated thing, right?
Yeah.
I think the way people make money is different. I don't, I don't know how much I should pontificate about this. I'm not, although I am interested in following the money. I mean, I think if you're dealing with a commercial art form, if you want to think in an informed and critical and intelligent way about a commercial art form, you have to think about audience demographics, and you have to think about technology, and you have to think about economics. And those are a lot of moving parts to try and keep your eye on.
Right.
But the only way to really... just to think of the comic book medium, which is kind of a latecomer. You got your comic strips that sort of get going in the United States in the 1890s and are a big deal by the 19-teens. But the comic book doesn't come along until the 1930s, and it's not perceived as a successful form of technology for communicating media and making money until Superman. So there is this really interesting way in which the superhero genre and the comic book form share an origin story. They're linked at the point where they take off, and that means that so that you see it right there. You see this combination of technology, economics, and content, all sort of coming together in a way that actually kickstarts this thing, and it goes from being this tiny vestigial wing of the publishing industry to being something that was an industry that, some of the figures that I've seen, like 1940, 1941, we're talking $20 million a year, which in modern money is $300, $400 million a year. This is a huge amount of money in an industry. Today, it seems to me that, the real big income is obviously the IP value of some of these older, more established characters as movie properties.
For sure.
But if you're doing an independent book and you've managed to acquire a significant audience, you could, if you own everything outright, you can probably do pretty well without even having to sell anything like the number of books that you would need to sell to be considered profitable by Marvel or DC. So and again, I think there's a climate there for a lot of indie people, if they're willing to if they can find that loyal fan base. It doesn't. I mean, I imagine for some people it wouldn't make any sense to write Spider-Man and get an audience of 150,000 people a month if you can have an audience of 30,000 people a month, but that you get back every penny that you put in. Right.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And that's something else you talk about near the end of your book is sort of this kind of in that same way where we talked about like old comics versus new comics, this like indie versus mainstream debate or whether to, it's kind of, it's a silly thing really to a certain extent, or it can be damaging. You sort of talk about too the discussion of the medium.
Well, yes. I think that there has been an academic tendency. I don't think it's as strong as it was when I wrote my book, actually, to be more critical ink was being spilt over what might be seen as art comics or comics lit. So the Alison Bechtels and Art Spiegelmans of the world were getting a lot more attention than, let's say, the Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue DeConnick's of the world. I'm not convinced that that's actually the case any longer.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's I wonder about this actually, because if you're a scholar of the novel, you might actually spend a lot more time with some. You might be a scholar of the pulp stuff, or you might be a scholar of more canonically elevated or recognized novels. And there are different sets of expectations and questions that you might bring to these things. And some of that is about ideology and snobbery, but some of that actually might be to do with perceptive differences about, audience and intention. And I think increasingly, to study comics is increasingly difficult, in part because there are now so many strata of kinds of work that are being done. And there are really interesting, sort of almost like poetry chapbook levels of material, where people maybe produce 2,000 copies of something, and it's got a very limited audience and maybe a very high art perspective. So Edie Fake's Gaylord Phoenix or something like that might be an example of something that probably is never going to sell in the hundreds of thousands of copies. but I think is really fascinating. And then you've got, kind of a middle brow thing, for the people who really, a lot of people like comics but don't want to read superheroes, but you've still got massive commercial success. I mean, Alison Bechdel would be a good example here, where universities have made her book required reading for the entire incoming freshman class.
Wow.
And, there's a Broadway show now.
Yeah, Tony Award-winning Broadway
you were just
show.
telling me about that. Like, when you said Alison Bechdel's work had been turned into, like, a Broadway show, I was like, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Like, I can't think of that interpreted in any other way.
But that's massive success.
Right.
That's a success on a scale that most of the people who are maybe, writing familiar titles at Marvel and DC are probably not going to get in their lives. And then there's this thing called, there's this odd way that people talk about mainstream comics, by which they usually mean popular genre comics.
Right.
And by which they used to mean superheroes. But I think increasingly a lot of these comics are not actually superhero titles. The Saga and all that kind of thing. These are... or sex criminals, The Walking Dead. These are enormously popular comics. They deal in pop genres. They're not superheroes, and they're still thought of by a lot of critical types as somehow representing a kind of mainstream. And I don't think any of this. I think what's gone mainstream is geek culture. And
now it's just culture.
Yeah, geek culture is now culture, and I think that that's fascinating. But that also means that, like a lot of other forms of interesting pop culture right now, there's a lot of, instead of there being one common text that everybody's reading, there's a lot of niche markets, and that's what you see at the really big cons. You see there are people who are there just for this one thing, and there are people who are there for other things, and there are people who are not there for comics at all. It's the same with, something similar has happened to music, it seems to me. My students passionately consume popular music, and some of them are very interested in the history of popular music, but it's very difficult to find one thing that they're all listening to. Whereas, when I started teaching even, back in the 90s, there were common texts. I could assume that everybody in the room knew. In 1993, believe it or not, everybody in the room knew Led Zeppelin, right?
I should hope that today everyone knows Led Zeppelin.
Not necessarily.
That might just be me, though.
Yeah, I don't think that's. Yeah, I don't think it's the common text that it was. I think that you can. And in fact, you can be, you can be pretty cool in the world of popular music and not. When Karen O did the cover version of the Immigrant Song a couple of years ago, I read an interview with her where she said she'd never actually listened to Led Zeppelin. and
excuse me, I had a small aneurysm just now.
Yeah, well, this is.
I like that cover too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the has a great band, right? But it's possible to. It was possible for somebody like that to be, and somebody who's very smart about pop culture and very smart about pop music, to have got to that point. And I think it's got something to do with the way we listen and consume. I think this is a post-digital phenomenon. There's just so much material.
Right.
And there are so many little byways that you can go down, that the idea that everybody is going to get into that one thing. If you... think to give a little illustration of how different it is, right? If you're watching a documentary about the Vietnam War, there is a really limited number of musical soundtracks that will accompany it. You're probably going to get the Doors or maybe some Hendrix, right? But there's a way in which there are certain historical events that have a particular soundtrack attached to them.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true for the present moment. No. I think that the technology has replaced the soundtrack, actually. I think that, the Beatles of the first decade of the 21st century was actually the iPod.
Yeah?
Because that's what changed how people listened. The Beatles changed how people listened in the 60s. The iPod changed how people listened to the Beatles. Listened to shuffle, for Christ's sake.
We've gone from like the monoculture to, I don't even know what you call it, like a multiculture, just like this pockets of culture that different people subscribe to all over the place?
I think so, which I think makes, which on the one hand makes, it means you can do things like what you guys are doing, which, you can...
Thank God.
Well, there's a lot of room for discussion. There's a lot of room for interesting critical thinking about these art forms that we care about. and that's cool. The if it is a downside to it, the downside, I suppose, is that it's really hard to have an informed and engaged conversation when there's so much material out there that people don't know. My response to it in some ways is to retrench a little bit in terms of about what really works for me. I think there's really fascinating work happening in the area of digital comics, for example, but I just don't like reading on a screen. So I'm always going to be late.
When trying to drag these two into webcomics for so long now.
It's kind of that same thing.
I'm fully prepared to accept, and I know, in fact, because I know, I do every now and again. Someone will guide me to something, and I'll realize how cool it is.
Yeah.
But I'm still going to want. When does the collection come out? That's what I want to know. I like to read on paper, and that's one of the way. And some of that, it's not just about being an old fuddy-duddy, or maybe it is, but in a different kind of way. There's a physical consequence to aging, frankly. My eyes, I can tolerate looking at and turning pages for a lot longer than I can tolerate screens.
What's cool with a lot of the technology we have today is that even 10 years ago, a lot of these webcomics that are out and about couldn't do that. But now, with the cheapness of production and stuff, we have webcomics that can, on a yearly basis, produce these big omnibuses of a year's worth of work, and it's incredible.
Which is how I got into someone like Evan Dahm, for example, who I just think is, a monster cartoonist and a genius of the form. And everything's out there online for people who want to see it. I just I wish the next collection would come out. I'm waiting for it. Right. I think his stuff is really terrific. But I encountered I had an experience at a con there where I was walking past somebody's booth and saw the cover design on one of those books and thought, oh, I actually want to know a bit more about that.
Right.
And that's the other, I suppose maybe that's the other reason why these festivals of geek culture are so well attended and so important. Is because it isn't. You will walk away having made a discovery if you.
Oh, for sure,
If you walk those floors with an open mind. If you're not there just to get one artist's signature, but you're there to see what you can find. I've never yet gone to a con and haven't come back with something new. So.
I feel like the first day of every con I go to is okay, I need to absorb the whole con, and that's just what I do the first day. And then I'll make notes of oh, that looked cool, and that looked cool. And then the second day is going back and finding those things.
I have a question. So you guys are obviously really pretty plugged into this stuff. So do you think that we're approaching critical mass in terms of what can be sustained con-wise? Because it seems like every major city...
I've actually had this discussion before, yeah.
They just have 165,000 people at New York City Comic Con?
Yeah, 167.
Well, it's not just that, but how many different variations on the con we have now? You'll have Comic-Con, which has now become this all-inclusive, it's all of the pop culture cons. But then you have your Kimura cons, which is what's the big one up in Seattle? The anime convention.
You're talking to the wrong guy about that.
That's it. Yeah. But then we also have there's a Nerf convention going on in I forget where, somewhere in the Midwest in the next couple of weekends, and it's becoming smaller and smaller little niche things that are also huge things. G-Fest is the big Godzilla convention that one day I will go.
Wow. Yeah. Well, you see, now this feels to me like it's actually bigger than organized sports, right? If you've got events, just working with the really big cons, if you've got 167,000 people at New York and 150,000 people at San Diego and 80,000 people at Emerald City, and I'm probably missing some intervening show. C2E2 is pretty huge,
right? Not even talking about the video game conventions.
Yeah, I'm just sticking to your classic Comic Cons now.
Yeah.
That's the equivalent. That's at least 6 annual events that are bigger than the Super Bowl. And that on the one hand, I think, yay,
right.
That's so cool. And on the other hand, I wonder how many of these cons will still be around pulling in those kinds of numbers, a decade from now.
Right.
I hope they're all still there. I think that would be great. It would be great for things like the University of Oregon's comics program.
Right.
If that continues to be true. I certainly don't think anything will fade away overnight because I mean, when I was a child, when I was my daughter's age, say, 6, 7 years old, and just started to get into comics, and it had began with this encounter with superheroes. I would have loved to have, I don't know, a Spider-Man T-shirt, right?
Right.
But you couldn't find a Spider-Man T-shirt. It was
Walk 5 feet in the mall today, though.
Yeah,
You're gonna
no.
fall over 6 of them.
No, back then, it was still the Western was still in some ways one of the dominant popular genres. As a child, you might be bought a Stetson and a pair of fake six guns more than anyone was going to buy you a Spider-Man or an Iron Man outfit.
Right.
But now, you can't. I mean, these images are stamped and embossed on every stampable and embossable surface,
Right.
and you can't walk around a Walmart without seeing this everywhere, and it's on everything.
Yep.
And when you're 5 and this stuff, you don't even have to have had the comic book encounter. You just see these bright, colorful, exciting-looking images. And I think the stuff that... So there's a whole generation, in other words, that's been getting hit with the excitement of some of this material
Right.
very, very young. And now it's
yeah.
everybody.
Without even necessarily experiencing the material, which is interesting to
But it
think
means
about.
it's not going to go away,
Yeah.
right? It means that when the 5-year-olds now are in their 20s and discover that you can actually go to college and take classes in the history of this material, they are really going to want to.
Of course,
And
yeah.
they're going to want to know about that. And in many ways, one of the most exciting things about teaching let's say the creation of Superman, if I'm telling people about Jerry and Joe and that whole sort of backstory, is that you realize that actually what you're telling them is about the first generation of modern geek culture.
Yeah.
Because before Jerry and Joe create Superman, they create the first science fiction fanzine, one of the very first science fiction fanzines in the country. So they're building a fan community when it was a hell of a lot harder to do.
Right.
But just because there are more people now who are interested and care about it, I don't believe that they are fake fans. I think they're real fans, and I think they look back at those geek forefathers and they want to know about them.
Sure, yeah.
So I don't think any of it's going to go away that fast. But I do wonder about the sustainability of a model where, for creators, if nothing else, how are the creators are supposed to go to all these shows and also do any creative work?
Of course, yeah.
I think it's about these cons specifically becoming these focal points of the social interactions that you can't necessarily get through, say, the internet, because you have a lot of these cultures developing and these like micro societies developing around these fandoms on the internet, say in like forums or on fan websites or wherever. So these cons allow for this like social interaction, this tribe mentality that can't necessarily be found via the internet. So with your bigger like Uber cons, you got your Comic Cons. That's like the mass, just like bleh of all of it.
Right.
But I think these smaller cons that we're seeing appear is this like physical expression of these smaller, more niche fan bases.
Right.
So I don't necessarily know if those are going away anytime soon, so long as these fan bases exist.
Yeah. No, I think that. Well, this is. I have no cynicism about that particular, this particular phenomenon in terms of the spreading of interests, the more people turning on to things that I've cared about since I was 5. I think that part of it is just great. I think that, in fact, I think probably the single most important innovation within geek culture has been the way that the fangirl has become visible in a way that was just not clear before. I mean, the comic book nerd had an image of himself always as a himself, and it's just not true. There have always been all kinds of people who dig nerdy geek culture stuff. Science fiction has attracted some of the most interesting writers of any gender in the 20th century. And I think that some of the work that will last longest is actually the work written by women. I think James Tiptree Jr.'s material, and that's actually a woman named Alice Sheldon, and I think Ursula Le Guin's material is probably going to outlast a big chunk of Heinlein's stuff as we move forward, for example. So the fact that it was always there, but it was somehow... James Tiptree Jr., who, as I said, is a woman named Alice Sheldon, and whose work I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in kind of, a real giant of 20th century science fiction. But she only wrote short stories, so there isn't a novel, so a lot of people don't.
Right.
She doesn't show up on the lists of the 100 great science fiction novels.
She doesn't have some big series that you can tout.
That's right. You've just got to find these short stories, which are really amazing. But she talks in the 1930s as a young girl getting into science fiction pulps, but hiding them from people, not admitting to anyone that they were hers, always claiming that they belonged to a boyfriend or somebody else if they found them in the house.
No, I swear, the Edgar S. Burroughs, that's not mine.
Yeah, that's not mine, right? So there's an example of a practitioner and creator who dug this stuff a long time ago, but felt that she needed to make herself her own fangirl status wasn't something that could be owned. And I think that's really transformed in the last 10 years in a way that is, really healthy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, and you're starting to see a lot of companies right towards that. I mean, I think Marvel's doing a lot of interesting stuff now, particularly with, aimed at young girls with protagonists who are young girls.
Sure.
Things like Miss Marvel or Unbeatable Squirrel Girl.
Sure. Which I actually have a copy of over there, but I haven't read yet. It's on my to-be-read
Which of the
stack.
two?
Squirrel Girl.
Oh,
yeah.
It's
Miss
great.
Marvel, of course, I have been reading.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Something that I'm curious to see with the sustainability of all these things as it's building and with this tribe mentality is there going to be a point where people look back and say, hey, we've been in this for so long and we've been referencing these things for so long. Like you said, when you grew up, if you knew about Spider-Man, it's because you read Spider-Man.
Right.
You didn't know about Spider-Man unless you had actually read something.
Right.
Now people know about him they just are inundated with him everywhere. And I wonder if there's going to be a shift or a split or, for lack of a much less horrific term, like a cleansing of, a separation between groups of people, who are... And that's
Schism
where
is the word.
Schism, thank you.
Yes.
Where I wonder if that's where conventions are going to be heading to. And I know that there's places like that, going to a physical comic shop versus like a Barnes & Noble now, or places on the internet where you can congregate more specifically for that. But I just wonder where that's all headed because...
Well, I think for the New York Con that I was just at, one of the things that I noticed was that Artists Alley had been put like way out on one side of the convention, and you really had to walk, around and about to get to it. And my first thought was a curmudgeonly kind of like, oh, I see. So over here is the big shopping mall, and here's where you get to hear, the Jurassic World theme music played over and over again on a constant loop, and here's where they put the celebs, and the comic creators are stuck out there in they're in a little, sort of ghetto.
Right.
But actually, then when I went to visit it, it turned out this was entirely the wrong feeling. A lot of the creators don't feel that way. They kind of like being in a spot that's clearly the comic spot. A couple of the creators that I spoke to, Joe Keating was one of them actually, who said to me that the thing is when people come here, they've come here for us.
Right.
And so it's actually in a way better to be here because the place was still full.
No, it's very true.
And everybody's was here for the comics.
Right.
So in a way that distinction across, when you've got a convention hall big enough, it worked. And there were people who might have showed up, to get somebody's, some movie star's autograph, who then, before they leave, decide to walk out and check out the Artist Alley, and they find something. So the really big shows, I think, through sort of what in the end turned out to be quite a sensible floor plan, can accommodate the various denominations and sects of geek culture. I suppose there will always be a possibility for schism within any act of cultural worship.
Right.
I think the way that
you worship the one true Spider-Man.
Exactly. And I think probably I've just never been that. I'm an intense geek, and I'm proud of it. But I've never really been that kind of geek. I don't think. I don't I don't take the investments as seriously as all that, I suppose.
Never been the type to say like, "Well, you're not reading the real thing."
Yeah,
If you love a thing, love a thing.
Well, and I think it's more about, because these are forms of literature and art, which I think is really one of the more interesting things about the last 30 years in comics, is people seeing it as a different medium entirely, even though it's still inside the same walls of the medium, is now with emotional connections to texts. If you see somebody at a convention who doesn't get why you have that emotional connection and are just there because they saw a Spider-Man movie,
right?
In my world, everybody gets along and everybody likes each other, and this doesn't happen. But I'm just curious to see if eventually that, you've got like the punk and the straight edge, and kind of like we're doing the same thing, but I'm doing it for different reasons than you are. And what that will cause inside of comics, because like you said, it's trending towards these immense numbers that you think cannot get any bigger, and yet every year they get bigger and bigger and bigger. I
just think of it as parallel to something like music, right? Where there are people who become absolutely fanatical about certain forms of mass phenomena, and then there are people that just like it okay. And yes, I will acknowledge that if there are people, I suppose, that if you're absolutely dismissive of an artist that I happen to consider a godlike genius, then I probably don't like you. But I might need to work a little bit harder to find another reason to like you.
Right.
But I don't, when I think of the things that I am myself fanatical about, I don't require you to like the Beatles like I do, as long as you're not going to try and provoke me by saying that they weren't really that good.
I'd love to tell you something about the Beach Boys.
These are conversations that I'm willing to have, right? But you don't need to feel the way I feel about it, as long as you're not, peeing in my sandbox.
Sure. I mean, what's interesting, you bring up because you talk about people come to comic conventions because they saw a Spider-Man movie where you had an emotional connection to the comic, but the exciting thing there is they had an emotional connection to the movie. I mean, that these characters can transcend this, that there are people who, it's so interesting, we've talked about before that we're sort of at this age where we saw the shift completely in this weird way that was like, in middle school, you were getting bullied for liking Spider-Man, and then just a few years later, that same kid who bullied you is now wearing a Spider-Man shirt because he saw this in the movie. And it's sort of like, to me, the exciting thing about, because there are people who are like, no, they only like the movies or whatever. It's like, yeah, but they like this character. This character endures in this way. I mean, almost in that mythological sense that you talk about in your book.
Yeah, I think it's got to be okay that people encounter there's almost a sort of a romanticism problem here. I mean, with a big R, sort of the artistic movement problem, where the first time you encounter something is the first time you encounter something, and over any sustained relationship, there is the danger of familiarity breeding a kind of contempt. So it's possible for those of us who've been deeply invested in certain expressions of geek culture for a good length of time to completely miss out on something hot that is happening right now because we kind of feel hipper than thou and feel like we've seen it before. It's equally possible for a newcomer to have their mind absolutely blown by something that we feel like, that really is kind of like not as good as when somebody else did that already.
Right.
And some of this is just to do with relative age and experience. And I think for those of us who are older and around for a bit longer, it's a genuine challenge to try. I mean, my brother, amazingly enough, given where we lived in Wales at the time, was really into Nirvana before everyone was into Nirvana.
Wow. Interesting.
he was writing to Sub Pop and all those bands, actually, all the Sub Pop bands. I remember asking him once, like, how the hell did you even know about this? And, you know, he was reading some pretty obscure zines and things. But, you know, he had like a clear vinyl 7-inch of one of the first Nirvana singles, and he had a signed Soundgarden disc from early on that he'd, you know, and it was he was there for this thing before everybody else was there for it. I remember listening to the first time I paid attention to Nirvana, thinking, I've heard something like that before. You know, because I was just that much older than him, and I couldn't, and I almost missed it.
Yeah,
you know, and then there came a point. You know, I think it was it was actually as late as In Utero where I was listening to that record and thinking, oh shit, no, hang on a second, this is now I
Whoa, back up.
yeah. Now I see. Now you know, my ears are open now, and backtracking through and finding other things to like about the material that I had missed. But that was partly a function of just being too much of a snotty 20-something-year-old hipster who thought I just thought I knew pop music.
I'm glad hipsters aren't a new thing. They've been around for a while.
Yeah, hipsters they're always hipsters. You know, I mean, the people who were into Crazy Cat in 1922 were the ultimate hipsters. The people who decided that they wanted to go to see the Crazy Cat Jazz Ballet, which lasts for, you know, a week or so in New York City, right? Those guys that's hip. If you were into Crazy Cat in 1922 and went to see the Jazz Ballet, you are like,
right.
You're as hip as Matt Fraction.
Which
Nobody's
is
that hip.
Yeah,
No,
I was
it's
going to say
true.
pretty hip.
Something to backtrack a little bit, because I don't see this conversation as linear, more of a wibbly wobbly.
Yeah, we're going all over. It's my fault.
No, it's totally fine.
I think you asked me about which comic I read, and I haven't shut up since.
This is exactly what we wanted. Is your story through that? But my question for you, I'm always fascinated with the cultural change in art forms. Like, you look at a band like Led Zeppelin,
Right.
and then you look at people right after that who want to sound like Led Zeppelin, but Led Zeppelin didn't get that way listening to Led Zeppelin because there was no Led Zeppelin. So they were
Right.
listening to Muddy Waters and jazz and all these other bluesy things to kind of create this sound. I feel like, personally, you know, up until the 80s or 90s, you get a lot of people looking back at the previous mediums.
Right.
All the pulp stuff, Doc Savage.
And the movies, especially.
And the movies.
Orson Welles.
Exactly. And the previous comics, you know, into the 60s, people looking back to Superman and Batman and all these things. But in the 80s and 90s, it felt like, well, now we have to do our own thing enough that we're maybe not acknowledging these previous works as much. Do you see that to be true, or do you see a trend shifting our focus more forward as opposed to backwards?
I think that in the 80s and 90s, it was certainly the case that a lot of the artists who drew pop comics, anyway, which is a sort of a term I think I prefer to mainstream comics, people who were drawing the genre stuff, which at that time would mostly have been superheroes, they were people who had learned to draw comics from looking at comics. I think if you look at Jim Lee's work, or you know, who's my favorite of that crowd, actually, Eric Larson, I think, is actually a really wonderful storyteller on the page, and but you can see a lot of Kirby in there. Whereas I think which is great, right? But I think if you look at that 2 generations back, let's say, if you're looking at a John Romita Sr. or a Gene Colan or a Steve Ditko or a Jack Kirby, or Marie Severin, all of those people look completely different from one another. There is they do not have a house style.
Yeah.
And that's because if they are looking at a comics art, there are shared comics texts for them, but they are newspaper strips rather than comic books. I mean, I think they all have Milton Caniff in their blood. They all have a fond feeling towards Alex Raymond, but they really look like their own people. I mean, no one looks like Ditko.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And so that's got something to do, I think, with coming into what is still a fairly young medium, and having drawn your influences from a lot of places outside of that medium. And I think the artists who were really, you could make it in comics in the 80s and 90s only looking at other comics, probably. Although I remember seeing one of the only times I've never had a conversation with Bill Sienkiewicz, but I've watched him talk to other people at conventions a couple of times. And I remember
Almost
watching,
as good.
Yeah. And I remember watching him do a portfolio review for a guy in the 80s at a con in London. And this was at a time when, this would have been about 85 or 86. So it had been a time when Bill really was, absolutely the cutting edge of what was going on at that point visually, I think. And he was really encouraging this person, this kid, really showing him the pages, to look at things other than comics. What he said is, I look at your stuff and I can tell that what you look at in order to draw is comics, and you're pretty good. Your grasp of anatomy is pretty good. Your storytelling is okay. But if you really want to get out there, you've got to look. You've got to move outside of this medium. You've got to think. You've got to know something about the history of, not necessarily the history of fine art, even, that he was advocating. He was talking about other commercial artists, but Bob Peak. I don't know if he mentioned that name, but I know that he has in other interviews talked about Bob Peak or Bernie Fuchs, artists who I only know of because of Bill Sienkiewicz, actually. But these are people who did movie posters and who did, in the case of Bob Peak, mostly movie posters that people would know. And in the case of Bernie Fuchs, it would be a lot of magazine illustration, some sort of the golden age of magazine illustration. His mastery of light is just unbelievable. These guys could really, really paint. And but they don't, if you were to talk to a 20th century art historian and ask them, what do you think of Bob Peak? What do you think of Bernard Fuchs? But they wouldn't know. They don't know those names.
Yeah.
Right.
The only way that you can access, but people who know the history of commercial illustration really know them. And I think that that's a stream that feeds into comics up until the 80s anyway. Now, again, it's so different, right? I mean, if you wanted to get into Bernie Fuchs in the 1980s, it wasn't like you could go online and put his name in Google. I don't know how Bill Sienkiewicz discovered him. So, yes, I think these things did change in the 80s and 90s. I think it was to the detriment of the medium in some ways that people were only looking at a sort of a prior generation of comics artists. But I don't think it's true of the present moment, in part because, again, the channel is open in a different kind of way. It would be almost hard to find somebody who's learning to draw comics only from comics now, simply because, visual reference material comes from the internet in a different way.
Google image searches.
Yeah, it's changed the need for a swipe file, though. Right? I mean, you look at these artists from the older generation; they used to have, just filing cabinets filled with pages they cut out of color supplements of magazines, anything from National Geographic, Life, all of those kinds of things. People who drew comics and who did commercial illustration generally from the 1930s to about 10 years ago had massive swipe files. And now none of that stuff.
Now it's a folder on your desktop called Swipe File.
Yeah. It's such a... That's so extraordinary that I think it's going to... I don't think we've really figured out quite how that's going to change things. I think that there are technological capabilities for the medium that we just haven't caught up with yet. I mean, we're still on the Wednesday monthly 22-page book thing. And that's only habit. There's no reason on earth that needs to be the format. And technology, again, it tends to sort of... I mean, the music analogies are really helpful here, I think, because if you think about how... those early Louis Armstrong recordings from the 1930s are 3 minutes long because that's what you could put on a wax cylinder.
Right.
And then there comes a point where you have a platter and you have 20 minutes aside, but it still takes 15, 20, 30 years before people realize, we don't have to just put together suites of 3-minute songs. You could actually maybe have a popular composition that is 20 minutes long. And then you get the eras of progressive rock and Pink Floyd, and let's have, the Who are going to release a double album that we'll expect you to listen to you will listen to it for 80 minutes in order to get the story.
Right.
And then we come back. That's way after the technology made that possible. Before people were really pushing it.
Yeah.
And then in the digital era, the single came back. Because in a way, the single had died, right? Between the 1970s and up until, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago, the single was a dead format. Now it's the dominant format again. So I think with comics, where we will see something like that, I couldn't even begin to predict what it will be. And I think it will be to do with people latching onto technological capabilities that are probably already there, and that we just haven't broken the habits of thought yet that allow us to see them.
Cool. So we'll turn now to a segment we do with anytime we have a guest on the show. We're going to turn now to a segment called Weird Questions with Donovan Eilert.
Oh, okay.
So
One of our favorite segments.
I've got a few.
I do like a weird question.
Well, I've got three of them for you. What is your favorite thing to eat deep fried?
Ooh. Oh, it has to be the potato. I'm sorry.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Any particular form, like JoJo's, potato wedges?
I like the British chips, which
Okay.
you really
Solid.
can't get here. They're a bit fatter and a bit
Yeah.
soggier.
Okay. In newspaper?
Yeah, with vinegar, with
Yeah.
malt vinegar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The next question is a little more abstract.
Mhm.
A penguin is about to walk in through the door wearing a sombrero. What is he going to say and why?
Would you like a tequila sunrise?
I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, I think that's the only answer. I didn't realize it was the only answer, but I responded. And even though this is no longer really a viable medium for this, what is your most prized, or was your most prized VHS tape that you had, or still have?
Gosh.
I like that this one's a thinker.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's been, well, partly because I'm sort of struggling to recall the last time
You had to rewind a VHS.
I had to. Yeah. I when Live Aid happened, we recorded it.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably, in terms of like my most watched VHS tape in my life, it probably the 20 minutes of the Queen performance on Live
Very
Aid.
cool.
Nice.
I think I watched that more times than any other VHS
Okay.
experience in my life. So yeah, Queen at Live Aid.
Queen at Live Aid.
Very
that
cool.
20-minute. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you
Great.
so much. Those were my questions. I had.
So that was Weird Questions with Donovan Eilert.
Yeah. No,
We turn now to the way we end every episode, where we do a recommendation segment where we recommend comics we think you should be reading. We always like to start with our guest. Ben, do you have anything that you think people should be checking out right now?
Gosh, there's so much new stuff, and I think anything that I name, I'll feel later like I should have named something else. So
Sure,
I'm
sure.
going to name something old. I'm going to recommend that people go back and read Peanuts from the late 1950s.
Interesting.
Because that's when Schultz is meanest. his cruelty to his characters is he's so savage and so bleak and so funny, and he's just coming in between 1956 and 1960 is when he comes into the realization of what he can do with the medium. That's about that. It's in that period that Snoopy starts to think and gradually goes from being a dog that runs around on all fours and chases kids for scraps of food to actually being this sort of weird emblem of the imagination that walks around on its hind legs and is really not a dog at all anymore.
Right.
So I think that people think they know Peanuts.
Right.
They often don't know that work. And I think it's some of the greatest American comics of the last 100 years.
Cool. That's an awesome answer. I like that. Granny, what have you got?
Well, I'm probably not going to go as far back as 1950s Peanuts, but mine's a bit of a throwback as well. I've recently started going through Walter Simonson's run on the Mighty Thor.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
it's-
legendary run.
And the fact that it had not been read by me up until now is sort of mind-blowing, considering I'm going through it and being like, oh, so that's where Beta Ray Bill came from.
I mean, it's really like the run on Thor.
Yeah, like with the whole Cert War thing, and like it's just... words do not describe how awesome this. Like, if you have any passing interest in Thor, like this run of Thor is what establishes tone and establishes character arcs that will carry on into Thor even into the present day.
And it looks great.
And it looks spectacular.
Have you seen the IDW book? Because that's
what actually I was about to bring up was they have this massive omnibus of it that just came out a little while ago. And I've always said on the show I'm always a fan of a book you can kill a man with, and this is a tome. I'm actually told that like it's more of an installation piece in your home rather than a book that you can read. Because it's like so large that by the time you get into the middle of it, it starts damaging the spine. Like the structural integrity of the book can't withstand reading it.
That's a good book.
That's a solid book.
That's very Thor would approve.
Yes,
This is true.
only the worthy may lift this omnibus. So yeah, Walter Simonson's run on Thor is
very
check
cool.
that out.
The recommendation I have this week, I think we may have talked about before, but if we have, check it out again, or I'll re-up this recommendation, is Mark Waid's Daredevil run. It's continuing still. I just think he's doing some incredible stuff with this. And also, I love the way he's sort of, he's not eschewing what's happened in the past, but he's really taken him back to what Daredevil used to be, as opposed to the sort of Frank Millerized version of him where he became a lot darker and more, certainly very Catholic and... but
everyone he ever loves dies.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of punishment for Daredevil.
Is it still Chris Samney illustrating it?
I think it is, yeah.
Because I think he's amazing.
Oh yeah,
it's really
I mean,
fun.
it looks
It's
gorgeous,
crisp and clean.
It's super. It's just fun. Really, mostly self-contained too. Superhero. I mean, stories of Daredevil that do feel like kind of classic Marvel in the best way possible.
Yeah, I've been reading. I'm about 2 trades behind, but I
sure.
agree with your assessment. I think it's a really fun book.
Yeah. So Mark Waid's Daredevil, I highly recommend. Donovan, what do you got?
My recommendation actually came from our previous guest episode with Dan Scotty, is Matt Wagner, Batman and the Monster Men. And I since then reread it, and it is so good. I love a good Hugo Strange story. He's one of my favorite Batman villains, and the fact that he creates monsters that Batman is no longer fighting. I mean, he fights the Joker and Penguin and everybody all the time, and it's great. But this new challenge where he's trying to get ahead of this brand new science is just so cool and so good. And I love a good Batman detective story.
Yes.
I'm really sad when the Bat computer is what solves the problem for him, because that's not the Batman that I grew up loving,
The world's greatest detective.
Exactly. I mean, you listen to Ra's al Ghul, and he
Who's
talks
got the
about
world's greatest search engine?
Yeah.
yeah, and that's where you lose me. So this story, I just think, is visceral, and I mean, the art is beautiful as well. Matt Wagner definitely knows how to draw, and tell a story, and it's, I don't know, it just is really fun, really good. I definitely recommend reading it if you're at all interested in Batman.
I love it when he actually illustrates his own scripts. I think I like him as a writer too, but for me, there's something special about a Matt Wagner project that he has sort of taken, that he's doing all the bits and pieces for.
Oh, definitely.
I love to see him illustrate his own stuff.
For sure. Yeah. All right, cool. So I think that's going to kind of wrap things up for this episode of Panel on Panels. We want to thank Ben Saunders for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for talking to me.
Is there anything you want to promote, or do you have any kind of web presence or anything?
I do not, no.
Okay.
I probably should say that, if people want to know more about the University of Oregon Minor, they can find me just by Googling Professor Ben Saunders and comics. You'll probably find me right away.
Okay, awesome. Very cool. Well, you can check us out online. We're at Panel on Panels on Twitter. We're on Facebook as Panel on Panels, Instagram, Pinterest. You can also email us at panelonpanels@gmail.com if you're so inclined.
And something we only mentioned very briefly on the show, and think we were going to talk about it more, and then had lots of other great conversations, is Do the Gods Wear Capes?
Which is available.
Ben's book. It's available just about everywhere.
That is
Any
true. You
bookstore.
can get it on Amazon. Yes,
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really interesting, fun look at kind of the psychology and the cultural relevance of superheroes, and 4 instances, knowing that there are probably many, many more you could go into.
Yes. Yeah, I spoke in that book just about 2 DC heroes and two Marvel heroes. I'm planning on writing another superheroes book, but this is
so also be looking out for that.
Yeah, that's just in its germinal stages.
Okay. Fair
Cool.
enough.
Well, yeah, thank you again for coming on.
Thanks a lot.
For Panel and Panels, I've been John Campbell.
I am currently Mike Ergoni.
And I will always be Donovan Eilert.
Keep reading comics, everyone.